So we have three speakers today for our job search school, we call it. It was sort of the back to school theme with, September and whatever. But we want to give you some actionable tips you can take away today to help you with your job search, right? We're not here to sell you anything. We're here to give you just free advice. And what you want to do with that is up to you, right? So our three speakers for today, Chelsea J. She'll be our first speaker. She's a career and leadership coach. She's a LinkedIn learning instructor, reaching over 50,000 learners before, working as a top career coach and featured as a career expert on Business Insider, CNBC, LinkedIn News, Career Sidekick, Career Addict, and much more. She's a speaker and workshop presenter at Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, governments, and universities. And she's going to help you today with finding your next boss and navigating job offers. Our second speaker will be Colleen Paulson. Colleen will cover general job search tips and resume best practices. She served as a contributor and analyst for Motley Fool for 4 years and been cited as an industry expert by major news organizations and job search sites, including Fast Company, Forbes, CBS News, Yahoo Finance, MSN, LinkedIn News, and Flex Jobs. And she works as a resume writer and executive coach. And finally, Greg Roche teaches introverts to grow their networks without going to networking events. He's the author of a book, The Fast and Easy Guide to Networking for Introverts, the publisher of The Introverted Networker, which is his weekly newsletter that delivers one networking tip to your inbox every Saturday morning. He's a content creator who posts weekly on LinkedIn and works as an executive coach as well. And he'll be talking about how to network as an introvert, which some of us are. So we're going to start off today with Chelsea as our first speaker. When she's talking, any questions you do have, feel free to type them in the chat box. And if we have time, we will call them out and read your questions to her for you. Okay?
All right. Thank you so much, John. And thank you to everyone who showed up today and is ready to listen and learn and really apply the strategies that we're going to share with you today. Now, I have a question for you all. How many of you have been intentional about finding a great boss? Feel free to throw it in the chat or let me know if it's not something that you've thought of. You've just kind of landed with the boss that you got. Well, I will tell you, as someone who worked at toxic work environments before, and for bosses that were not that great, I have perfected my ability to find the perfect boss. All right. Okay, so I'm going to share some of those tips with you first. First of all, think of finding your boss. It's almost like dating, right? Do you notice that we create these lists of our dream person that we want to be with? We break down all those characteristics, what they look like, what their personal values are, some of the natural traits they have, and what they're really good at. But when it comes to a boss, we don't really think about it. We're just kind of like, if the money's good, if I get good time off, I'll just go ahead and take it. But the truth is, your boss can make or break your experience at a company because they are truly your first line of defense anytime that you want to raise or you want to go for a new opportunity or try something new or go to a professional development opportunity. They are your key to that. So we need to be more intentional. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what traits does my dream boss have? And I know sometimes we can get lost in the weeds or just think of surface level things like, oh, I want them to be nice. Okay, that's great. They can be nice, but people can also be fake nice. So let's talk about what their character looks like. And it's helpful to collaborate with others and learn from others' experiences with their bosses. So feel free to throw in the chat, what are some traits that you value in a boss? So for me personally, and a lot of my clients, they value honesty, right? You want someone, oh, that's a good one, not micromanaging me. Yes, advocacy. Yes, okay, we have some really good ones coming in. Someone who wants to invest, integrity. There we go. That's something that's really important to me. I want a boss that is going to tell me the truth, be honest, not sugarcoat anything. That's something big. Someone who has morals and values, knowing right from wrong, someone who's not going to backstab you or gossip about you to your colleagues. And the reason I'm saying all of this is because I've seen a little bit of everything in the workplace. So again, you need to be very mindful and intentional with creating that list that you want for your ideal boss. So once you have that list of the traits and characteristics that you want, you also need to ask yourself, what kind of boss do I thrive under? What type of work style works best for me? I saw in the chat someone said, I don't want someone micromanaging me. Okay, so that means you want a boss that trusts their employees to carry out their job based on their level of expertise, right? So that's something that you would straight up ask someone. Hey, do you trust your team to do their job? Or are you hovering over them the entire time that they are working, right? So after you come up with that list of the characteristics that you need and as well as the type of boss that you thrive under in their working style, now what I want you to do is get comfortable with number one, self-advocacy and asking questions. I meet a lot of professionals who are terrified to ask questions in interviews and of current or previous employees. But you need to be comfortable with shamelessly asking questions because that's the only way that you find out information. I myself used to go into roles without asking any questions because I didn't want to rock the boat. I said, I don't want to upset anyone in here, but quick mindset check. If someone gets upset with you during the onboarding process because you asked a question, that's a what? Red flag. You don't need to be there because what if you really need help once you're there and you have a question? Are they just going to get mad at you every time you ask a question? No. So get very comfortable with that. Number one, you need to ask questions in the interview. Anytime that they ask you, hey, do you have anything for us? First of all, ask, who am I going to be directly reporting to? And if they're in the room, just let them know, hey, I want to build a relationship with you and make sure that we will work together great. So I'm just curious, how would you describe your management style? And here's another tip. When you're asking your future boss questions, avoid questions where they can just say yes or no. You want to leave it open-ended because either they will wow you and excite you, or they'll dig their own hole and you'll be like, oh, okay, this is not the type of person I want to work for, right? So just ask them, what's your management style look like? And they can explain that. Another question that you could ask them, if you value a boss that is really into collaboration or trusting the expertise of their employees, just ask them, hey, when is the last time your employee came to you, gave you some feedback, and you implemented it, or you allowed them to take off and run the project? Can you give me an example of that? And see what they say. And their answer will let you know whether or not they trust their employees or advocate for their employees as well. Another question that you could ask is, hey, I'm just curious, if I have a question or concern or I'm having a problem, how would you like me to approach you about that? That's another one as well. I've had bosses in the past where they're like, I don't want to touch it. You handle it on your own, even if it was way bigger than me. And I'm like, hold on, I need your advocacy here. I actually need your help navigating this. And if bosses are unwilling to help you navigate a problem, they're probably not really good with conflict. And having a boss that can't manage conflict can also be a challenge. But if you're okay with that, at least you will know in advance. Now, if you have other questions and you're like, hey, how can I ask about this trait? Feel free to throw it in the chat and I'll help you with the way to kind of finesse that question so that you're not necessarily stepping on any toes or making anyone uncomfortable. Okay. Now, aside from asking directly in the interview about the traits and characteristics, another thing you can do is ask current employees or previous employees who have worked there. I like talking to previous employees because they don't have any tie to the company anymore, right? So they can just tell you straight up, hey, this is exactly what I experienced. This is how they were, and this is what I suggest. And sometimes they'll tell you to run, or they'll tell you, no, this is a solid person right here. So don't be afraid to reach out. And of course, through the search function on LinkedIn, for example, you can find previous employees. And when it comes to current ones, just approach them in the way that, hey, I'm interested in working for this company. I was looking at the org chart and I noticed that the department I'm interested in, it looks like this person runs it. Do you have any insight that you are willing to share? Not everyone will do it based out of fear sometimes, or they fear retaliation. But if they're willing to talk to you, keep your answer straight to the point, and also just let them share with you and be able to read between the lines, right? So I'll give you an example. Recently, I was overseeing a panel and a candidate asked, hey, can you describe this culture, the workplace culture, in one word? And people went down the line. They said, it's a bit overwhelming at times. Another person said, it's stop and go, and then smiled. And I'm like, okay, I hope that the candidates could read through the lines when you gave them those answers, because that does not sound like a place that anyone wants to be. It sounds very chaotic. And I'm just giving you two, but they went down the line and they said a lot of things that I hope that the candidate picked up from there. So that's an example. Okay, now when it comes to navigating the job offer, okay, so you found a boss that gave you all the great answers, you talked to previous employees, current employees, bam, good to go. Okay, so what should you look for in a job offer? Again, this is where self-reflection comes into play, and you want to think about, what is it that I need from an employer? Before a lot of you came on, we were talking about flexibility, the hybrid workplace, remote work. Is that something that you need? If you value flexibility, you need to be looking for that in the job offer. If you are moving to a new job because of you need more pay, you probably want to find out about their yearly pay increases, whether or not they have bonuses. Do people get promoted often, or is that something that's hard to do? Will you end up in the same position that you're currently in? Because the thing is, whenever you leave an organization, your goal is to get better and better and better each time. You don't want to have to settle so that 2 or 3 years later, you'll be back in the same position, right? Okay, here's another one. Ask about the professional development budget. Look at that. See if they've allocated certain funds for each person to take advantage of memberships or participating in conferences and webinars and workshops. See if they are willing to invest in your professional development. And if you do work in the office, see what their perks are for working in the office. Do they offer lunch? Do they have free parking passes? Right? So just think about the things that bring you joy, keep you satisfied, and that you need for your own personal well-being as well as your family life. And that's what you should be looking for in the job offer. And finally, do not be afraid to ask. Whenever you're getting that job offer, that's your final time to negotiate what it is you need. So I don't want you to get in a role and then wait until a couple weeks later and say, oh, I forgot, can I get this? Because that's not gonna, that's not going to look very well, right? When it comes to impressions. So get what you need up front and then continue to increase from there. But I can go on and on about this, but we have two other amazing speakers. So John, I'm going to let you take over from here.
Thanks, Chelsea. Any questions for Chelsea or anything that maybe we need to touch on really quick? Feel free to put it in the chat room. I'm gonna have to rewatch a bit of that because there's so many good questions you listed out there, and just to get them, they're some pretty good ones.
Thank you.
I think there's one question here, or maybe that's just Greg. I'm just reading over here what he's saying.
Yeah.
It was a comment. That's all good.
Awesome.
All right. So we're going to go next with Colleen, who's going to be talking about general job search tips and resume best practices. Thanks, Chelsea.
Thanks, Chelsea and John. So let me pull up. I have a slideshow to share. Let me share my screen. See how savvy I am here. All right. So I decided to do it as a presentation just because it's kind of easier that way. So, you know, as we get started, before you even sit down to think about writing a resume, you need to know what you want to do, and so often folks will come to me and they will say, oh, I'm ready to, I need a resume. And I'm like, well, what's your goal? And they'll say, well, I'm not sure. Well, listen, it's kind of like taking a trip, but not knowing where you're going. And so like trying to draw a map, but you have no idea what the destination is. Like that's what it feels like to me, because if you sit down and write a resume and you don't know what your goal is, then it's kind of, I don't want to say a waste of time, but you really need to sit back and ask yourself some of those great questions that Chelsea, has just kind of brought us through. Those are part of, before you even think about looking for a job, you need to think about, hey, what is what environment do I work best in? What kind of team am I looking for? And then, kind of think through how you're going to position yourself for those sorts of roles. So I could spend 3 hours talking about how to write a resume. I'm going to try to condense it and, make it as fast as I can. But, basic resume format tips for those of you that haven't written one in a while. Please don't put your picture on it. I know in Canva right now, there's some great, templates that look modern and they have your picture. Unless it's an acting resume or an executive bio, your picture doesn't belong there. And I get the confusion, right? Because on LinkedIn, we want you to have your picture, but on your resume, we don't. The way the convention is today, we're not putting pictures on resumes. You don't need to put your home address anymore. When I started doing this work 17 years ago, we still put home addresses, but sometimes we were still sending resumes by snail mail, and we're not doing that anymore. So for your privacy, and honestly, with the way things are today, people don't need to know your home address until you're all the way out through the hiring process. So just city, state is perfect. LinkedIn URL. I can't tell you the number of resumes that I see that don't have it. And it's you should be using that your LinkedIn profile to kind of complete your story. Hopefully you have some great recommendations there. Maybe you're featuring some of your work in your featured section. So make sure it's easy for folks to find you on LinkedIn, and adding your LinkedIn URL to your resume is, one way to help the hiring team to find you. Clean format. For me, I'm not a columns person. They don't, sometimes they don't parse well through the tracking system. So, I'm like pretty much a plain resume person. I don't, plain font, 2-page minimum, not a lot of graphics, just because I'm afraid of how that's going to go through the system. And chronological, not functional. So, I often work with executives, and some of them have been working for 40 years, right? And so they don't necessarily want people to know that they're in their 60s, but they want to tell their story. And so there's a temptation to go to a functional format and kind of go through skills. And when you go to that kind of format, the first question the hiring manager is going to ask is, what are you trying to hide? Why aren't there dates here? So I'm not saying you need to have every date, but a chronological format is really the easiest. It's the easiest for a hiring manager to read. So yeah, you don't need a fancy template. Instead of thinking about graphics and background colors, for me, just try to think about your, quantifying results. Take some time to do transferable skills and think through how you can best position yourself for those roles. And and again, I've been doing this work for a long time. If you talk with 10 different coaches, they're going to have 10 different approaches for doing this. And so there's not a one size fits all way to go about this. I have some marketing folks who, they use their resume as a way to, and that design is a way to kind of show their creativity. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm giving you what works best for me, and you'll hear from other folks, and they'll tell you what works best for them. Okay, so what should you have on your resume? I love a resume headline. And again, I don't see it enough, but that's like, there's a statistic out there that says that the average recruiter spends 6 seconds looking at your resume. I don't know if that number's true or not, but what I do know is that if you have a headline on there, it's a great way to grab the reader's attention. And so, your headline can be your goal title. You can make it, the skills you want to highlight. There's a lot of different things that you can play out here, but just, you want to grab that reader right away. You also want to do that through the executive summary. And so if you remember writing resumes back in the 90s, we had objective statements, and that's just, at this point, that's not where we're going. We really want to have a summary kind of, highlighting the impacts that you can deliver. If you want to quantify results there, that's awesome. But you want to name drop clients, that's great too. But anything, think about the reader and what is the reader looking for, and then make sure that that's in your executive summary. You want to share your skills, you want to share your experience, of course, your education. And then we get into the additional sections, whether it's certifications, awards, volunteer work, board roles. For me, I love volunteer work, and I love to call it community leadership, because that's what it is. Often I find folks, doing awesome things in their communities, and they don't give themselves credit for it. It's like, oh, I'm treasurer for, my son's baseball league with 1,000 kids. But I don't have that on my resume. It's like, well, for me, that belongs there as leadership, because you're not getting paid and you're really making a difference in your community. And for me, that, and for many employers, they love to see that. So I'm going to walk you through quickly a resume example. And so again, we have, your basic information, and here's the headline. So this person wanted to be a finance manager, but you can, again, make that headline whatever you want to make it. In this case, we're name dropping the companies that this person worked for. If they worked for Fortune 500 bank and that's on page 2, I'm making sure to name drop that in the summary so that you don't have to flip to page 2 to know that. And the goal is to get the reader to flip the page and read page 2 by name dropping that. So, talking about managing 300 million in spend, the community leadership work, presenting to board of directors. These are all things that kind of set this candidate apart. And so that's why we mentioned them in the summary. For this person, we chose to outline their biggest skills, and we spelled out exactly what they were doing in their role. So often people will assume, that the reader knows what a finance manager does. Well, guess what? They might not. And with the way titles are today, it's going to mean different things for different places. So you've got to spell it out, leading 3 direct reports. If you have folks reporting to you, whether they're direct, indirect, spell it out. If you're reporting to the CFO, you should say that too, because depending on how, big or small your organization is, you want to make sure it's clear how you're influencing executive leadership. So in this case, this person was presenting to the CFO and senior counsel, and we made sure to emphasize that. So for this person, we also kind of decided to separate out their bullets. You don't want a wall of bullets. And so in this case, we gave them headers, process and program improvements, trusted financial expertise. But again, trying to quantify results, calling out, whenever you're influencing executive leadership, whenever you're presenting at the board of directors, all of those things that kind of set this candidate apart from other folks. And again, so 2 things I want to talk about on this piece of it. Number one, folks will often ask me, how do I talk about early career experience? And so in this case, we've called it out here without years for their time at Fortune 500 bank and also at Walmart. But it's okay to do that, especially in these cases where the experience was relevant and we didn't want to exclude it. but we didn't want to call out the fact that, it might have been from the year 2000 or from 1996, so it's a way to not, to give yourself credit for all of that great work without sharing the dates. And then again, this person, treasurer of the youth baseball team, so we called it community leadership. They did have some MBA coursework, so we made sure to give them credit for that as well. So I'm going to walk quickly through some common questions that I get. How do you catch up when you haven't reviewed your resume in years? And listen, this is so common because if you've been with the same company 5, 10, 15 years, you may not have needed it. And so I get that it's overwhelming to get started. If you still have access to your performance reviews, you can start there. You can look through your calendar. You can do, what I recommend for my clients is to do a quick brain dump. So, I love to work with paper and pen. Some people are better to, use Google Notes, or they have their own technique, but whatever works best for you, set the timer for 5 or 10 minutes, and just quickly go and, write down all the great things that you've done, but don't think that you're going to rewrite this resume that you haven't updated in 15 years. You're not going to do it in a day. So just give yourself some time to kind of brainstorm and think through, all the great work that you've done. If you've worked at the same company for a long time, how do you call it out? And so as you saw in the quick example that I shared, we used headers to kind of call out different areas of experience. In a 2-page resume, you may have room for that. You may not. But, again, because we start with the goal in mind, you can figure out exactly what you want to emphasize. If you've been working for 30 years, you can end up with a 30-page resume probably. But you got to, pick those highlights and you'll stick with that for the 2 pages. So again, that's just, for this particular example, we decided to call it out, using headers, profit growth and operations, customer satisfaction, and personal development. So that's just how we chose to do it in that case. So again, best way to trim resumes is the career note that we talked about earlier. Here's a couple more examples. So that's my super quick way, again, I could have talked about it for 3 hours, but I don't know if there's any questions or anything else that, and one more thing, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, please reach out and connect, because I try to give tips every day, but I'm happy to connect with anyone that's here today.
Have a question from Greg about how you handle career gaps on your resume.
That's a great one, Greg. So I typically use a career note. So just like in those examples, I had a career note. I'll say, took caregiving gap from 2003 to 2006, volunteered at XYZ school, or took, courses in, finance, or whatever you were doing during that time. But that's a wonderful question. And I just typically use the career notes to do that.
Another question from CC was, does the additional experience translate well in the ATS?
In my experience, it works well enough. I mean, every system is different. So, but in my experience, there hasn't been an issue in not including yours for that part of the experience.
Thank you.
A question from Judy here about cover letters. Are they appropriate? Varied approaches? Optional? What's your thoughts on cover letters in general?
So this is, again, one of those things where if you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different opinions. For me, if they ask for a cover letter, I recommend providing it. My cover letters are super quick. So I'll pick 5 or 6, of the top accomplishments and, think through, why are you interested in this role? What sets you apart? If you have a special connection, let's say if I have a client who is, interested in the company for a special reason, maybe they love the product or, they have a special tie. That's a great place to add that in. But I wouldn't skip it if they ask, if they're asking for it, I would provide one.
Yep. Any other questions, folks? I don't think any right now, but some more may come up later. Thanks, Colleen. We'll pass it over to Greg.
Yeah, so I bill myself as the introverted networker, but I think that all of this is gonna work for anybody. It doesn't just have to be introverts that are the ones who can benefit from this. I think a lot of people struggle with networking, and so I want to focus on 3 networking challenges that I hear from a lot of people and talk about ways to overcome those challenges with some actions that you can take to help you kind of get your networking going. And the first one I hear from people is they'll say things like, I don't know anyone, or I don't know where to start. So typically, especially if you're in a job search, you're going to be coming into this thinking, okay, where do I start? Where do I begin? What do I even do? Or maybe you're not even in a search yet, but you have a job, but you're thinking it's time to make a change. Maybe you're thinking, hey, my company's going to make us come back to the office. I don't want to come back to the office. I need to start looking for my options. How do you even get started? And again, people say, well, I don't know anyone. I don't know who to contact. And I always tell people, start with who you know. Too many people sleep on the network they have, especially if you've worked in a number of jobs over the years. You have a network. You have it whether you realize it or not. And that is the place where it's the easiest to start because those people already know you. They already trust you to a certain extent. And if you go back as you're following Colleen's tips here and you're creating your resume and you're spending a couple minutes saying, where did I work? What's my experience? As you're doing that, think about the 1 or 2 people you really enjoyed working with at those different companies and start to make a list of those people. Even think about, where did you sit back when we were in the office? What did your office look like? Who did you talk to on a day-to-day basis? Where are those people? Because there's a good chance that those people don't work there anymore. They've moved on to other jobs. They work other places. They've had other experiences. Those people are really valuable connections in your network. And we call those dormant ties. And that's a term that was in an Adam Grant book called Give and Take, one of his earlier books. And it's based on research from MIT of people reaching out to dormant ties, people they've worked with in their career, and trying to reestablish that connection. And what they found in the research was those dormant ties were extremely valuable to helping people who reached out to them. But you have to be very intentional. Again, make that list. And I had a coaching client named Maria who had moved to a new city for a job. She'd been there a couple of years. She didn't really know anybody in town and hadn't spent a lot of time networking. And so when we started working together, I said, make a list of 10 people you've worked with in the past and then reach out to them. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated. It's a simple note that says, hey, it's been a while since we worked together. You crossed my mind the other day, was wondering how you're doing. And she did that. And I didn't hear from her for a while. And then she came back around and she said, I reached out to those 10 people, and one of those people was an old boss that I had had, and we got along well. And, I had gone on to another opportunity. He had moved on in his career, and we got back in touch. And just through our interactions, he said, hey, I've got a role that you might be interested in. I don't know if you're looking, but do you want to talk about it? And she said, yeah. So just from that simple outreach, she was able to completely find a new job. To kind of, the company she was with, she was a little bit worried about their financial stability. So that's why she was looking, but she was able to find another role just by going back to one of her dormant ties. Now, of course, it's not always going to work like that. That opportunity is not just going to fall in everybody's lap. But your dormant ties are people who also have networks of people. And so when you're connecting with them and talking to them, they're the people that are going to introduce you to new people. And that's how your network grows. So none of this has anything to do with going to an event or, sending cold outreach. It's simply getting back in touch and reconnecting with the people you already know, and then talking to them, and then getting connected with new people so that your network grows and you can open yourself up to some of those new opportunities. So that's kind of the first tip there. And again, tagging on to Colleen's process, something that you can do as you're revamping your resume. So you can combine this in your job search strategy. But I would just say this should actually be a list of people, whether it's 10 or 20 or however many you can come up with, that you can start to put that list together and then just start simply reaching out to them. The second thing that people say, and especially when I talk about reaching out and starting to have these conversations, is this is going to be awkward. They know I'm looking for a job. How do I do this without feeling like I'm just asking them to help me find a job? So people say that because they put themselves in the other person's shoes. They think, people have come to me before and said, like, can you help me find a job? And I've said, I don't know. I don't know of any roles. I don't know what to do. I want to help you, but I don't have anything. So people think about that and they go, I just don't want to be that person that reaches out to people asking for stuff. One way to get past this, and a pretty effective way, is change your mindset here to more of a giving mindset. Think about networking not just as, oh, I'm going to go find a job, or I'm going to get a lead, or I'm going to get a referral, but how are you going to help these people you're reaching out to? So thinking back to those dormant ties, as you're talking to them, because after you reach out to them and ask them how they're doing and try to reconnect, there's a good chance you're probably going to have a phone call, or maybe if they live in the same city, you guys can have coffee, but you're going to be in this conversation. And what your whole goal there in that conversation is to ask the other people what they're working on. Ask them what's going on in their life. Ask them what challenges they have at work. Ask them questions. So again, going back to kind of what Chelsea was saying, be I would say generous with your questions. Ask a lot of questions so that you can kind of start to understand what other people are working on. And as they're talking, listen to them and think of, what can I give to this person? And the part where people get tripped up here is they're thinking it has to be something big. It doesn't. It can be something so small that it doesn't seem significant to you, but to that other person, they're going to take it as, wow, I was talking to Greg in this conversation. He gave me a lot of great insight and value. I really want to help him out. It can be advice. It can be an introduction, because you're going to be out talking to all these people and networking. You're going to meet a lot of new people. Maybe you're having another conversation and you find two people you could introduce, and that connection is valuable to them. It can be a recommendation for a book or a podcast or a webinar about job search. You can give a lot of things really easily to your connections. And when you're doing it from that standpoint, people find it becomes a lot less awkward because they don't feel like they're taking right away, but they're giving first. So approach this with a giving mindset. And if you ever wonder, what's too small, I would remind you, there's an author and a psychologist, Dr. Robert Cialdini. He wrote a book called Influence. And in that book, he talks about the concept of reciprocity. And he calls out some research that was done on restaurants. And they tracked restaurants who gave either a fortune cookie or a mint or something small with the bill versus those who didn't. And they found that when a restaurant gives you that small cookie or that mint, people tip more than if they don't give something. So we have this sort of reciprocity built into us as humans, that if somebody gives us something, we want to give back to them as soon as we can. So how you use that is you think about, again, you're giving to somebody else first. What they're likely going to do, whether they're thinking about it or not, is say, wow, that was so awesome. Thank you for that idea or that recommendation or the introduction. How can I help you? And then you don't even have to ask them for anything. They've asked you how they can help you. So it kind of opens the door for you to kind of walk through and say, well, here's how you can help me. So again, you can kind of, some people might take that and say, oh, that sounds like you're kind of manipulating them. It's not really. Again, it's just our wired subconscious concept of reciprocity that we all have. So um, as long as you're coming from a positive place and you're actually giving them something, I think it's something that most people can get comfortable with. So when they say that, what do you do? And this is sort of the third challenge people run into is they say, well, I'm working with people, or I'm sending them information about me. I'm sending them my resume and I'm not hearing anything back. So my last tip there is be easy to help. And what do I mean by being easy to help? Make it so easy for the other person to do something for you in return for what you've given them that they can't say no. I would say resumes are important for hiring managers. They're important for recruiters. They're important to put in the ATS, all those sort of things. But when it comes to giving it to your network, if somebody gives me a resume, I'm like, great, what am I supposed to do with this? I got to figure out who's the recruiter, who's the hiring manager. I got to track it down. I got to figure out who I'm going to give it to. Makes it really hard for me to do that. And so that person has made themselves hard to help, which makes me not want to help. So be very easy to help. And a couple ways to be easy to help is get very specific and clear with what you're asking people to help you with, and make it so small and easy that, again, they can't say no. So ideally you would know, hey, I would like to meet this person, the actual name. Do you know that person? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Now, most people aren't going to know the specific person you want to meet. So one thing I recommend is that as you're thinking about your job search, what are the top 10, 15, 20 companies that you're interested in working at, or at least learning more about to see if you want to work there? Maybe they're in your industry, maybe they're in the industry you're targeting. But what is the names of those companies? And actually create a document called a target company list that has those on it that you can give to your networking contacts when they say, how can I help you? And you say, I'm interested in learning more about these. Do you know anybody that works at any of them? Now, they may not. They may say no. But by putting that list out in front of them, they're looking at that and they're thinking, well, I don't know anybody at one of these companies, but I do know somebody at a company that's similar. Would you like to meet that person? Great. Would be perfect. Maybe I've never heard of that company. Maybe it's my dream company. I don't know about it. Or maybe that person I'm going to be introduced to knows somebody at one of the other companies on my list. So don't just, close the door if they don't know somebody on the list. The other thing it does is it just primes our connections brains to access the information in it. If I were to say to you, who can you introduce me to somebody, or who should I meet? Like, you're flipping through the mental Rolodex, right? I mean, I think most of us know what a Rolodex is. We're old enough to understand what that reference is. But you're flipping through the mental Rolodex. You're like, I don't even know where to put my finger in and start looking, right? But if you have those list of companies, it helps you narrow it down as the person who's looking at the list. So ideally, what you're going for is, number one, they know somebody on the list that they can then send an email to and say, hey, I have a connection named Greg. I think you should really meet him. Here's his email address. I'll let you guys take it from here. So simple, so easy. And that's all that person had to do. They helped you out. They feel like they gave back to you, and now you've met somebody new. Now, if they don't know anybody, they're going to take that list with them, and you've now taken advantage of what's called availability bias. You've planted those companies in their brain, and more than likely, whether it's an ad on TV or maybe it's a job posting they're going to run across, they're going to see those companies in their day-to-day lives. They were going to see them anyway, but they weren't going to pay attention. But now that you've primed their brains, they're going to be looking for those companies out in the world, and they won't even know it. You've created what I call opportunity scouts out in the world. And those people are walking around, and when they see something for one of those companies, they're going to say, Greg was looking at that company. I got to connect him with that. So you're putting people out in the world who can actively be looking for you. So those are my 3 tips on how to network a little bit more, how to overcome some of these common networking challenges. I do have a bonus tip if we just have a couple minutes, which is, if you're networking and you're thinking, am I doing this right? If you're ever wondering, am I coming on too strong? Am I overreaching? Am I doing too much here? Am I making this awkward? I always say, in networking, as with most other things in life, remember the golden rule. Treat others how you want to be treated. If you're about to send a message to somebody and you read it and you go, man, I would not want to get this email from me, then don't send it. Rewrite it. Rewrite it in a way that you would like to receive. If you're going to ask somebody to do something for you, say, would I like to get asked to do this? And if you think, nah, this would kind of be hard for me, make it simpler. So flip the script, step into the other person's shoes. And if it's something you're like, yeah, I would respond to this, then probably go ahead. But if you're thinking, man, this is probably coming on too strong, then it might be, time to rewrite it, rethink it. But that's how I always tell people, again, if you're running into the resistance, think about what the other person's view of it's going to be, and that'll help you make a decision on whether you need to rewrite it or not. That's it. Those are the tips. Should work for introverts or any extroverts or anybody else.
Sounds good. Any questions for Greg, guys?
No questions. Quiet group.
I guess one thing I would ask real quick would be, once you've, let's say, farmed your dormant connections, right? Because some people have more than others. What would be the next step that you'd recommend then?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have more than they think, and there's a lot of people they forget. So what I would say is if you just go through your brain and you can't think of anybody else, another thing to do is go to your LinkedIn profile, and that should have all your work experiences there, and go back to the companies you worked at, and then you can search on those companies. You go to the LinkedIn search, you go to all the filters, and for past companies, you put that each company in that and do a search, and then start to go through the list of names that come up in the search results, because there's likely people you forgot about. And you may already be connected to them. And so for some of those, you might want to reach out on LinkedIn just to, make sure they're active, make sure you can get in touch. After you've gone through that, I would say, and done that with all your companies, again, most people, when you start to do that and you really dig in, you're going to find more people than you think. If you've gone through all of that, and again, this goes back to LinkedIn, start following the people who are at your target companies. So again, take that target list and start trying to find people who are active on LinkedIn at those target companies, and start not necessarily connecting with them, but if they are active and they're posting, start leaving comments on their posts so that they start to recognize your name, so that when you do connect with them, you're somebody that's kind of familiar, and you're going to be a little bit closer to starting that sort of online dialogue that you can then turn into a video call or a phone call. So, that should, I mean, and again, if nobody's active, okay, you might just have to send the connection requests and move on to, trying to connect that way. But I think between those, you get a pretty good start. And if you're having those conversations and you're working through that, people will start introducing you to other people. And remember, you're not trying to get hundreds of connections here. This is not CRM. This is not sales. This is not you having a database of customers. You're trying to get to a couple dozen connections because you're accessing their connections from there. So again, don't say I need 100 people on my list that I'm going to keep up with. You won't be able to keep up with them, and you won't be able to do it genuinely, and it's just going to take up all your time. Focus on a smaller number of really strong connections that you can work with to help you get connected to bigger networks that they're already connected to.
Sounds good. Some great advice there, Greg.
Yep.
I know a lot of people have trouble with the networking piece, and it doesn't come as natural for everybody, right?
Yep.
I know if you're introverted as well, it can really be a big drain on your energy level, having to talk to people and do the whole schmoozing piece, right? So
yeah. And again, I think if you're starting a lot of times from that group of people you might already know, yes, it can get draining. At the same time, it can also be less sort of intimidating because you've kind of got something in common. And I would always say, again, kind of back to something Colleen said, is break it down into like a 5 or 10 minute chunk or 15 minutes. I always like 15 minutes because it's basically 1% of your day. If you can spend 1% of your day sending a note, sending an email, maybe having a quick conversation, phone call with one person, usually that's not going to wear you out too much. It's if you try to do 3 or 4 hours a day where you're really going to be burnt out. But smaller chunks, smaller steps, more consistently over time is probably going to get you farther and be more sustainable than trying to sit down on a weekend and bang out, 100 LinkedIn messages that you're trying to send to people.
That's the life of a recruiter.
Yep. Yep. So,
Yeah, it can be tiring for sure. So
yep.
I get that. Some good advice though from all of our speakers today. And what we're gonna do after is post a video of today's event for everyone to see on YouTube, as well as send a short email sequence to everybody with introducing each of our speakers. We have some free content to give you from them as well and introduce you to them more formally. And we look forward to having you guys join us again, and good luck with everyone with their job search. So just want to say a final thank you to Chelsea J, Colleen Paulson, Greg Roche for today's event and their time for contributing.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks
Thanks for
having us.
having us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good
Thanks
rest
so
of your
much,
day.
everyone.
All right, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.